Hi everyone, and welcome to our 8th and penultimate seminar in the Rylands Lunchtime seminar series. I'm Guida Armstrong from the Italian Department and the John Rylands Research Institute at the University of Manchester, and I'll be chairing this session today. So this session is coming to you from various rooms in the John Rylands Library on Deansgate, and we'll be showing some collection objects and discussing some research on them as usual. The seminar today is entitled The Love and Glory of His People, Victor Hugo as Political Symbol, and it will be presented by Kevin Morgan from the Politics Department and Janette Martin from the John Rylands Library. Before I introduce our speakers, I just have a few housekeeping notices. So as usual, this event is being recorded and it will be edited and made available on the John Rylands Library YouTube channel in due course. Audio subtitles are made available using your own settings. We're using the Zoom webinar format, so this means that your camera and mic is disabled on entry. At the end of the session, there should be about 15 minutes for questions. So if you'd like to answer one, please could you put it in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And then the questions will be selected by me as the chair and relayed to the panel. You can also use the chat function for comments and questions as we go through, and we'll be monitoring both the Q&A function and the chat as we go through the seminar. So as I said, we'll have time to take a few questions at the end, and we're hoping to finish about 12:45, 12:50. Finally, we would love your feedback on this as usual. This is the first time we've run a seminar series like this, so we'll be sending out a feedback survey to you all at the end. Without further preamble, I'd like to introduce you to our two speakers today. Kevin Morgan is Professor of Politics and Contemporary History at the University of Manchester, and most of his work to date has been on the movements and ideologies of the 20th century, including international communism's cult of the individual, on which he's published a book with Springer and made a film, which is on YouTube. In relation to this seminar, he tells me that he became interested in searching out the 19th century roots of the 20th century politics of personality, and it was in this way that he became interested in Hugo and discovered that we had this wonderful collection of material at the Rylands. Presenting with Kevin is our very own Dr. Janette Martin, who repeat viewers will know that is the research and learning manager at the Rylands. And amongst other things, she curates the Modern History Archive collections. Her research interests her in mid-19th century British radical culture and political speech, and she has a long-standing interest in history from below. So thank you both very much for talking to us today about the collections, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Guida. So where better to begin than with a photograph of Victor Hugo, who is the subject of today's talk. So when it appears on your screen, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this photograph here. Excellent, we have it on the screen. So this is a photograph here of Victor Hugo in old age. Victor Hugo, as I'm sure most of you will know, was a French poet, novelist and playwright, and he's perhaps best known to UK audiences for his two novels, Les Misérables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So the picture that you can see is Victor Hugo in old age, and it's quite a sort of famous image. But what I want to do now is talk a little bit more about the object that we have in front of us. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you can get a sense of the scale of this book. So this book is called the Livre de Victor Hugo, which is the golden book of Victor Hugo. And you should be able to see that it's a very beautiful binding. It's brown leather, it's gilded, it's patterned. It's actually quite big. You can probably see the size of it compared to my hands. And I'm just going to show you inside now. So beautiful marbling. And we're going to get to the title page. And from the title page, we can see that it was a limited edition. We've got edition number 287. I'm not sure how many were produced, but I would guess not many. It's a very lavish production. So you can see on the title page that it was printed in 1883. And that was 2 years before Victor Hugo died. You can also see that it's printed by a quite famous Parisian art publisher. And it's also described as artists and writers that were contemporaries of Hugo. And they did lots of tributes. So there's all of the volume is about authors and artists writing something specially for Hugo and giving something to him. So I'm going to scroll through because eventually the image I want to show you is right at the other side, but it'll just give you a very good sense of what's it about. So here's the names of all the artists. And one thing that strikes you quite quickly is just how many images there are in this book. There's beautiful etchings, there's engravings, but there's also something that's called a photogravier. And here's one of them there, which was a sort of very novel new French technique in which you could take a photograph and translate it onto a plate that then could be used in a sort of conventional printing press. So I'm just giving you a sense. So there's 112 artistic drawings in here, and some of them are absolutely beautiful. I'm going to keep going a little bit more so you can get a sense of this. It's really clear when you look at this book that it was created for a wealthy audience, and it was very much a public tribute to Victor Hugo. And what I want to ask Kevin is, we know Victor Hugo was an amazing writer, but what had he done to deserve this apotheosis?
I think apotheosis is the right word for it, because he was a sort of apotheosis of the Republic, I suppose, in France at that time. When this book was produced a year or two earlier, Hugo had celebrated his 79th birthday, and there were huge crowds gathered outside his home in Paris. And he'd become this amazing public figure and almost a personification of the Republic. Had a huge funeral when he died, as Jeanette says, in 1885, and his ashes were taken to the Panthéon. So there was a sort of posthumous cult, if you like, of Hugo. But look, there's that scene of the crowds outside his home already during his lifetime. So he was venerated as this symbol of the Republic.
There was another image I wanted to show you as well, Kevin, and it's right at the start of the book. Probably easier to do it this way than go leafing again. And it's the engraving that you'll recognize, or some of you will, from the poster advertising this event. It's just the page after this one. Yeah, and I'll try and zoom in a little bit. But it's a beautiful representation that is a stylistic representation of Hugo through time. So we see him as a young man in the middle, we see him middle-aged, and then we see him at the top as sort of bearded, venerable old man. There's also, I couldn't work out whether it's meant to be an angel or a baby, and I suppose perhaps either would be appropriate. But the question I had for you, Kevin, was, were these images of Victor Hugo quite familiar at the time?
They would have been familiar, yes, because in a sense, we all know that image we started with, that's how we think of Hugo, this sort of sage with the beard or the grandfather figure. But he'd been a public figure and a well-known writer, really throughout his lifetime from the 1820s as a young man. So these images would have been familiar to his contemporaries. And I think they were important to that sort of political symbolism that he exercised, because he was born in 1802. Basically, across the entire century, he had lived through, 4 or 5 regime changes in France, 2 moments of sort of terrible sort of military defeat and coming to terms with military defeat. And so, and a highly, as symbolized by these regime changes, deep divisions of faction, party, political culture. And I think the reason why Hugo became such an important figure in this period was in part because he offered the possibility of transcending some of those divisions through a figure he'd begun as a royalist, he'd become a liberal, he'd had his phases of Bonapartism, he'd ended up as more of as a Republican, a Democrat, even a sort of socialist. And as his works were all available and were circulating in tens of thousands of copies in the early Third Republic, he became a symbol of unity, I suppose, for elements of this highly divided, infant and very fragile republic.
So we're certainly very lucky to have one of the finest and largest Victor Hugo collections. outside of France at the John Rylands Library. And yet it's always struck me as rather incongruous that a sizable chunk of his correspondence ended up in the north of England. Do you think Victor Hugo would have been very pleased to think of his papers being used by not only researchers in France, but researchers here in Manchester?
I think he would have been horrified, to be honest. I think that he was, Hugo was a very complex man. And we can think of him as the advocate of the United States of Europe. He's sometimes, especially in France, he's cited as a sort of pioneer of the idea of the European Union and a sort of federal conception of Europe. So in that sense, there's Hugo, the internationalist, and an inspiration to Democrats across Europe and beyond. But at the same time, his was a worldview that was very much centered on France and particularly centered on Paris. He couldn't have imagined a United States of Europe whose capital was anywhere else but Paris. He saw Paris as this sort of great successor to Athens and to Rome, as playing a similar role in the modern world. And it always got a strong attachment to the idea of French greatness, albeit it could be expressed in different ways, and in a sense those ways changed over the course of his lifetime. Yeah, these are interesting documents because his family background is important, because he had very crudely, his mother was a royalist and his father had been a Bonapartist general, and a Bonapartist general who also wrote who also had his own aspirations as a writer, and wrote a long mock heroic poem, The Revolt of the Underworld, which you can see there at the bottom right, which we're lucky to have here in Manchester. And Hugo had almost a sort of cult of his father. He hadn't been that close to him actually for many years, but he wrote poems, odes to his father, and it wasn't the writer that he invoked, it was always his father as the soldier, the hero, the man of arms. And I think I mentioned he was born in 1802. I think you have to think of Hugo as somebody who's brought up amongst these images of military conflict, French military greatness, and with these ideals of a war that he himself then never has an opportunity to fight in. And I think you can find in many of his writings this idea that the age of greatness through the sword and through the battlefield was to be succeeded through greatness through the field of letters and culture. And Hugo, in a sense, saw himself as wielding a pen in the same way that his father had a sword. So his father sent him advice on how he should be writing his early poems. I don't think he paid much attention to it. And he was more interested, not in that manuscript so much, but in his father as a hero of the empire, basically.
So I'm curious, did Victor Hugo ever visit Manchester?
He didn't. And it's very interesting and sort of significant that he didn't, because under I mentioned these regime changes that France goes through, they include the Second Empire under Louis Napoleon, and Hugo was the most, I think, the most famous opponent of the Second Empire, who went into exile, resisted the coup of Louis Napoleon, and therefore spent 18 years in exile. But significantly, he went to the Channel Islands. He made no real attempt to learn English, hardly set foot on English soil. When in 1852, he did visit London briefly. He described it, I've got a note I made here, a huge black city, lugubrious and hideous. He said that the only desire you had if you went there was to get out again as quickly as you could. So what he would have made of Manchester, I don't know. If you've read Les Misérables, you've read the sewer scenes in Les Misérables, I think it would be a combination between perhaps those scenes and something like maybe Friedrich Engels on the condition of the working class in England. So he didn't idealize cities like Manchester, and he didn't idealize England. So no, he didn't.
So while he might not have favoured the geographical location, I do like to think that Victor Hugo might have appreciated his papers being in such a fine neo-Gothic building, and in particular being next to other, literary greats. So we have Shakespeare, we have Milton, we have Dante, we have 19th century giants like Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens. So in that respect, even though we're not Paris, I would have hoped that he would have appreciated Shakespeare at least. And I guess many of our audience might be wondering, so how did the Victor Hugo papers end up at the John Rylands Library? And the answer really can be traced back to decisions made by the library in the mid-1960s, when a Hugo scholar called Jean Godon worked at the university's French department. Godon encouraged the library to buy around 800 Victor Hugo letters in 1965, and he was to continue as an academic at the University of Manchester for 18 years. And during that time, the library continued to buy up Victor Hugo materials. But one thing that's quite noticeable was that the collection was not catalogued for quite some time, and it was quite unknown, underused, I think it's fair to say. But all of this changed in 2015 when a French archive student did a summer internship, and he created this marvelous, really, really detailed catalogue for us. And if you're interested in that, in the chat field, there will be a link to the blog post that will tell you more. And also in the chat field, there should be links to the printed catalogues of Victor Hugo and also the letters. I've got some more material out here to show you some of the three more letters from the Victor Hugo collection. And the first of which was written on the 11th of August, 1841. And I'm going to let Kevin set the scene and explain the significance while I scroll to the most interesting part.
Yeah, this is a letter that dates from one of the more nationalist phases of Hugo's career. 1840 was really one of the low points in Anglo-French relations in the 19th century. A contributory factor in France, I think, may have been that in 1840 there was the return of the ashes of Napoleon to Paris. Lots of solemn ceremony. They're in the Invalides, where perhaps some of you may have visited and seen the memorial to Napoleon in the Invalides. For that occasion, Hugo had written a long poem, The Return of the Emperor, which was rather chauvinistic, full of Napoleonic fervor. And I think one has to remember that in this period, a poet like Hugo was really not just writing for a literary coterie and a small elite audience. It was almost like this was the vehicle through which he gave his almost like a running commentary on political affairs in some periods. All sorts of examples of that from across his career. So this circulated in a large edition, and actually all his various Napoleonic poems were brought together at that point and circulated. So the occasion for this letter is they were erecting a Napoleon column at Boulogne, sort of looking towards the English coast across the English Channel, and he was asked to write a cantata, and did write a cantata, which is somewhere else. But this is the reason it was never published during his lifetime. And the reason that this letter is interesting is it helps to understand why, because the committee that was responsible for those ceremonies politely declined. They commend, I mean, if you see the text of the cantata, he describes the English, the sort of hatred for the English sort of at Napoleon's feet. It's also not very favorable about the Russians either. He sees these as these two malevolent forces almost at the two edges of Europe and slightly beyond it. And because there were going to be British visitors at the ceremony, the organisers politely declined, while at the same time they commend him in this letter. It's very polite. They commend him for the way in which he's combined what they call the sacred fire of poetry with the sacred fire of nationality. So this is a letter that, that's one strand of what Hugo represented for France and the French. And it was that, it was the memory of Empire and Napoleon. That was one element of his complex makeup.
So I'm going to take you to our next letter, which is slightly harder to read. It's also quite badly damaged, as you'll see. It's got a hole in the center. If I scroll up, you can see that somebody has written on it, Alphonse Petit. Could you tell us more about who this character was?
I couldn't tell you as much as I'd like to be able to. I mean, and don't know that much about the writer Alphonse Petit. And you can see, compared to that previous letter, it is the hand is more difficult to make out. But what we do know about Petit is that he was part of a movement of worker poets that flourished in the 1840s. And to some extent, at least in the case of Petit, they look towards Hugo as a source of inspiration. So there's another strand in this complex personality. Hugo was at this time really an establishment figure. He'd been elected to the Académie Française, a member of the peer, made a member of the peerage in the 1840s. But in his writings, he already expressed ideas of the people rising to the full height of their capacities as they had, or as he described them as having done in the Revolution of 1830, one of the French revolutions of the 19th century. And so this, I think, is a particularly interesting letter because there are numerous accolades to Hugo, his greatness as a writer in the material at the Rylands. But I think this is one that's interesting because it illustrates the wider acceptance of the role that the writer could play as a sort of symbol for movements of change, of democratic aspiration. And Hugo had that influence, not just in France, but internationally. Hugo wrote several poems about monuments like the Arc de Triomphe and the Vendôme column, the Napoleonic column in Paris itself. But here in this letter, Petit addresses Hugo himself. He describes him as he'll be a monument for posterity, essentially. So standing as a figure that exemplifies, but also stands above his own times, whose genius will only properly be appreciated by posterity. So there's, if you like, the more democratic as well as the more nationalist part of this complex persona.
We're going to move on to our final letter now, which is from Victor Hugo himself. So this letter, and my French is not very good, but one word leapt out to me on the fourth line, and I can definitely make out Shakespeare, and it looks like he's writing to somebody in England. Could you tell us a little bit more about this letter? Yeah,
this is a very interesting letter, very interesting moment. It's a letter to the organisers of the committee to mark the tercentenary of Shakespeare's birth. And it's Hugo thanking the organisers for proposing a toast in his honour at the celebratory banquet. And he explains how deeply moved he is by this mark of friendship and the idea of the writers of one country expressing their appreciation of another. He says it's not just an act of generosity, it's a matter of an honour for him.
So he admired Shakespeare, so that must have been an exception to his sort of Anglophobe tendencies.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly admired Shakespeare, and he wrote about he wrote a play about Cromwell. He wrote about various English mainly subjects. I think, yeah, he admired Shakespeare because he had this idea of the writer as a sort of national symbol. And it would be Dante, who we know about here in terms of Italy, Cervantes in the case of Spain, and Shakespeare would be the literary symbol of England. Although it's fair to say, I think he would have said that Shakespeare achieved greatness in spite of being English rather than because of it. And there's also letters, there are letters here to the socialist Louis Blanc expressing his indignation at how long it had taken them, that they weren't contacting him about this anniversary. He's in the Channel Islands, his son had translated Shakespeare into French, which is why he thought he had a certain sort of entitlement. And in 1864, Hugo wrote this book on Shakespeare. So this is the next book, a major book in prose, at least, he publishes after Les Misérables. And it's not really a study of Shakespeare, although there's some of that in it, but it's really a sort of hymn to the idea of the literary genius who, as I was describing, rises above their age, but symbolizes the sort of, not just the present times, but the future aspirations. And so that was quite an important publication of Hugo's at this point in relation to the themes I've been talking about.
So if Shakespeare was the the symbol, the national symbol of England, who would be the French equivalent?
He was sort of, he was not a modest man, but he was not, he didn't say himself, but nobody could mistake the fact that Hugo was himself was creating a pedestal on which he was the only figure he could imagine being put. And so he certainly saw himself in precisely those terms. So to that extent, there was this sort of, almost like a cult of Hugo, the writer, as symbol of nation, of people, of republic. And he was, as much as anybody, the architect of that cult.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's so wonderful to hear about your research into our collections and then to demonstrate the apotheosis using books and letters. So thank you for that.
Thank you both for that fabulous presentation, and thank you for taking me back to my undergraduate French degree as well, which is quite a long time ago now. We have some questions coming in, but I thought I might exercise my chair's privilege and start with a question myself. Kevin, I wanted to ask you actually if you saw anything about the cult of Hugo as anticipating the 20th century, because you said that was why you kind of went into the 19th century. Are the commonalities? Does he, how does it play looking forward?
That's the question that I'm really interested in, because it was through looking at 20th century cults of personality that I realized how important figures like Hugo or Garibaldi, for example, in Italy, were as sort of precursors and maybe as models. So I got interested both in Hugo and also Thomas Carlyle is the other figure that I'm interested in. And clearly there are major changes in forms of political organization, political communications, and so on. And I think it's also interesting. I'm interested really in how particular individuals can be invested with this sort of symbolic importance by different movements, different states, I suppose, different parties, but also that they might be different types of individuals. So there's a difference between Hugo. Hugo, he wants to be the successor of Napoleon in many ways. I mean, he does have this real, not quite obsession, but is his abiding fascination with Napoleon. But he sees himself as the Napoleon of the world of letters, and that is quite a crucial difference. So, so I think, yeah, there are anticipations already, but there are also, that's not to just draw some sort of facile equivalence between them.
And I am going to follow up quickly, because I mean, one of the things when I think about the kind of 20th century kind of cults of personality, and especially how they, co-opt national figures and things, but I always think of it in terms of the media. So, especially visual culture, the moving image, is there anything kind of characteristic about the kind of media in the media in which Hugo's kind of personality is kind of transmitted, in his lifetime? Is it just printed books? Is it,
He was abreast of the changes that were happening as they were happening. So the one thing that interested me about Hugo and Carlyle, who were more or less immediate contemporaries, Carlyle was a few years older, was first of all, they both grew a big beard at exactly the same point in their lives and acquired this sage-like appearance that we identify with both of them. But also with Hugo, it was actually photography. Once in the Channel Islands, before actually you briefly saw an image there of the sculptor David d'Angers did these portrait busts, and that was how he was being depicted in the 1830s. But with photography, he became quickly aware of the importance of the photographic image, how it could be circulated in large numbers. So in a sense, in as much as those technologies became available, he was ready to use them. Yeah, I mean, that absolutely.
The image that we used at the beginning of the talk, that was one of the sort of early examples of a photogravure. And when I looked it up on Wikipedia, it was interesting that the very image that they have as this new technology is Victor Hugo. And the chap that did it was, you know, a professional. He was a Polish exile in France. And he was one of the earliest people to do portraits using this new technology of photography. And it's interesting that, you know, Hugo was one of his first subjects. And also Queen Victoria, I think, was an early sitter for him.
Oh, wow, that's great, especially when you think about the kind of historic photography work that we do in the Rylands as well. So I have a question in the Q&A, but I'd like to encourage any of our viewers to put some more questions in because we do have some time. Megan has asked, are there any plans for a Hugo exhibition at the Rylands in the future? So
I don't think in the immediate future, but if they were interested in seeing our materials, reader services is open 6 days a week. Anyone can come and view them. So, you know, if you are interested in seeing more, do come and visit. But yes, who knows, one day we may have a Victor Hugo, but there's none sort of in the immediate pipeline.
Are there any anniversaries coming up? I mean, that seems to be a kind of spur for them. But...
The only there have been exhibitions. There was one on the centenary of his death in the 1980s. I mean, they made a huge amount of it in France, but there was, using the collection here, there was a conference at the Rylands. There is a publication that came out of that. And actually the theme of the conference, one of the themes was, it was like Hugo and the wider world. So that's where, if you want to read about his views of the English, there was a very interesting paper given there. So I think that when this material was being put together, there were a couple of exhibitions. So there would certainly be the potential there. I'd have to think about the anniversary that would fit best, but there's always one that you can find.
Well, there's always one yeah, you can always find something, can't you? So I don't know if we've got any more questions. I mean, I have a list.
I was going to say, I have a question for Kevin. So I've known Kevin for a good 20 years, and when I first met him, he was working on biographies of Communist Party of Great Britain scholars. So I just wondered how you moved from that to Victor Hugo.
So really, it was actually, I moved from British communism to European communism, reading a lot of material from the French Communist Party in the Popular Front period and into the Cold War years. And in a way, this links a little with the question you were asking in Guida, because I actually became interested in, there was a sort of battle over Victor Hugo that one can trace through 20th century France. In the Cold War, the Communist Party in Paris had a huge campaign about the fact that the Nazis under the occupation had removed him from the pedestal on which his statue had stood in the Place Victor Hugo in Paris, but it had not been replaced. And they said it was like an American Coca-Cola advert had been put there instead. So it was a sort of a real Cold War image, but it was the fact that these figures, people were still sort of mobilizing on one side or the other. So I'd always thought of him as a figure of the left. That's why he did interest me. But then also figures of the nationalist right. People like Maurice Barrès, if you study French history, would definitely be identified with the non-Republican, anti-Republican right. But they could all, and were anti-Republican, but they could identify with Hugo. And in fact, I mean, Barrès did in his fiction and so on. So that's what really interests me. So partly it comes out of that interest in the left, but I realized that Hugo was far more than just a forebear of the left in the way the communists were describing him.
So we've actually got, sorry Guida, we've actually got an audience member present in the room, and he's interested in Victor Hugo and he might have a question. So I'm going to try and relay it back if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, sure. Don't swing the camera in case we lose you, but...
No, please don't swing the camera. I might actually just take my microphone over there, so bear with me. Oh, yes, there is.
Hi, Kevin. Wonderful to be here as well. Excuse me, but obviously I've been working a lot on late 19th and early 20th century French communists. I was just wondering when you said that, how much, when you've been studying their biographies and the primary sources associated with their life, how much do they actually read Victor Hugo? And how much for them is he just a well-known symbol? Because I always assumed, and I think probably wrongly, but I always assumed that Victor Hugo's popularity, it does stay until the late 19th, and then he enters this kind of period where he's not read much, but I can only speak for England. So I was just curious about France, and are there any records of these people like really studying his work, so to speak?
So there are records of his readership, and you're absolutely right. It declines, and this one of the things they did on this centenary of his birth was they did all sorts of quantitative, indications of the circulation of his editions, how much they were used in schools, and it tailed off. In terms of the left, that may have been less so, or at least I think they were reading selections from Hugo, because there's a vast body of work that you could read, but they were producing editions of particularly things like his political poetry. So he published this, Les Châtiments is this collection of poetry directed against the Second Empire, and particularly against Louis Napoleon, which he'd hoped would have a mass impact in France itself at the time. And it didn't, but it became widely known after 1870 with the fall of the empire, the establishment of the Third Republic. And I don't know of a collection of political poetry with so much sustained invective that I've read. And so you can find the editions where they're extracting that for a communist readership. So they're not reading the royalist odes naturally, but they are reading the political poetry, which would almost be like a model for anti-fascist poetry and things like that. So, but not the mass readership about. I think you're right about that. Absolutely.
I mean, I would just add he's got massive cultural penetration now, hasn't he, with Les Misérables? So the kind of the adaptations has kind of, he may not be read, much in the original French in this country anymore, but there is that huge kind of, he has become in a sense sort of the go-to source for certain kinds of depictions of the French working condition.
Guida, should I also just answer? Jane has a question up on chats there. So that's a second question there. Can everyone see that, or should I read that out?
If you can read it out and then answer.
So this is, do you think that Hugo was unique in his views of the importance of writers post-Napoleonic wars and setting up a pedestal for himself, or was this a wider attitude of writers in the time while Hugo has just stood the test of time? And essentially, I don't think it was unique at all. And if you look at a figure that's really important for Hugo as a young man, as a model, almost like I'd say the prototype of this type of figure was initially Byron. And actually in the period immediately after the Napoleonic Wars, the two figures who stood out as the sort of tragic romantic heroes in France that Hugo's generation would look back on and up to were Byron and Napoleon. So again, it's these figures of the man of arms and the man of letters. And there's a very interesting French writer that wrote, I think it's been translated into English, but called Paul Benichou. And he wrote a whole body of writings about this sort of sacralization of the figure of the writer, is what he writes about. But what also interests me is it was partly, it was like in a period of religious decline. Was the writer now stepping into this role? And that ambiguity which you mentioned about, is that a baby or is it an angel?
Yes.
There's the ambiguity about his use of religious language, but he, at the same time, he's not religious in the conventional sense. So there is the sense that he might be stepping into that role, or the writer might. But as I say, there's the part that I'm also interested in is there's a famous chapter. If you want to read Les Misérables for the story, you skip it, but it's a long chapter on Waterloo, And one of the and he goes to Waterloo in 1861, and sort of for the first time he can bear to visit the battlefield site because he's not wanted to do it at first. But he describes in that chapter how the century turned. Waterloo is the hinge of the century, and it's the hinge at which the man of arms gives way to the genius. The man of letters, which we're always meant to read the subtext, is going to be Hugo himself more than anybody else. But but absolutely, I think one could think of other examples, and one could think of, for example, English writers like Swinburne was a huge admirer of Hugo, so he himself also was a model for writers in other countries.
Brilliant, thank you. So I think we've come to the end of the questions. I think we've kept brilliantly to time. So I think I can thank our two speakers again for their terrific presentation and for teaching me things about the collections that I certainly had no idea about. I'd also like to thank everybody for their comments and questions, and the tech team as well, who've done their usual brilliant job running the show. Next week's seminar will be the very last one of this series. It'll take place at the same time and on the same link. And it's entitled Cottonopolis, The Making of Global Manchester. And it will feature Jeanette again, speaking with Dr. Edmund Smith. So you can find out more details about this on the library's What's On page. And I hope, we've got the link in the chat already for everybody. So thank you all for joining us. A virtual round of applause to our speakers. And I hope I'll see you all again next week.